All right. So on that note, we're going to get started. And, we have such a busy schedule in our 10 weeks. I would love to take more time for us to network and get together. And I'm hoping in future classes, maybe our last class, that we can all meet in person. I think that would be a really great celebration of our 10 weeks. All the last two during COVID, we didn't. So this is kind of a little bit newer territory because I know we can. So just, mark that in your books and just know we're going to have lots of conversation as the time goes on. But I definitely want to start getting into the information. And we have our first speaker here today. And the topic that we're going to be talking about is grand jury. And, for me, I worked before, prior to being at the prosecutor's office, I worked as a defense attorney, I worked as a magistrate. But the one thing I didn't do was prosecution. And the one thing I did not get to really know about was grand jury until I came here almost 3 years ago. So it's such an important part of the process. It's a great place to start. Usually I like to start with our victim, our victim section of our office, because we are a victim-centered office. But the cases and how we get things starts with grand jury. So I think it's also an important place to start. And it's such an important job. And we have Marissa here from our office who's in charge of our grand jury. Marissa, I can't see you, but I saw you earlier. Are you on? You're here.
I'm here.
Okay. So we're going to ask that you introduce yourself and then give us a fun fact before you start your presentation.
I'm Marissa Pappas. I work for the Summit County Prosecutor's Office under Sheriff Bevan Walsh. Like Tanya said, I am the assistant prosecuting attorney. I run grand jury. I'm a lifelong resident of Summit County. I have 2 kids. So if you hear children screaming, they're just right over there with my husband, and he's keeping them at bay. And my interesting fact, I have never had coffee.
Oh,
I've never tasted it. At this point, people try to get me to try it, and I'm holding out. I hope to go my whole life with no coffee.
What a great accomplishment.
Thank you.
All right, do you want to go ahead and share screen, or should we have James do it? James is ready.
Whichever is easier. I have it
He's
up.
really good at clicking, but we always think it's easier for you, so you don't have to say, next slide. But
Marissa, I default to you, Marissa.
I'd rather you do it because I like to be able to see the people. And when you share your screen, you can't see the people.
That's good.
I like to see who I'm talking to.
So while Marissa, or we're loading Marissa's presentation up, it's a PowerPoint. We're going to try this time. Number one, I'm going to make sure we stay on a time schedule. What the goal is to have the presentation and then have as much time as we want for questions at the end. So if somebody needs to log off, because we always ended up going later, and people were, the classmates in the Citizens Academies were always so good with staying and asking the questions and having the conversations. And I really love that. But I want to honor your time as well. So we're going to have Marissa present, and then at the end, we'll have questions. If you have questions you want to get out right now, put them in the chat, or write them down and wait to the end. We're going to let you do them verbally, and you can do them through the chat bar. I could ask them. I will be monitoring the chat while Marissa is presenting and making a running list of questions.
Hey, Tanya.
Yes, James.
Actually, I think you are. Hopefully, you are at home and you have the PowerPoint open.
Oh, I am home, and I do have the PowerPoint open.
Well, I knew you were home, but because when I tried to open it, it gave me.
Yeah, can you try it again? Because
I will try it. I will try it again.
I just X'd out of it. I apologize.
So I'm sorry. Just give me a second as my really slow computer.
We're not on a time crunch. Don't worry about it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Just kidding.
Uh-huh.
Oh, look, Nanette said she never had coffee either, Marissa. Did you see that?
You know who else has never had coffee? Sherry Bevan Walsh.
Stop.
Yes.
Oh, you ladies.
Now I know 2 other people who have not had coffee.
We should all get together for coffee.
Absolutely not.
Coffee date.
I'm not a big fan, but I've had coffee. But I usually don't drink it.
All right. Okay.
All right, so here we go. Marissa, you go, and I will just hopefully.
Sure, you can click to the first slide. All right, so grand jury is located within the Summit County Court of Common Pleas. We are on the, I guess technically the basement level. We're kind of tucked away in a back corner of the courthouse. And I would argue that's probably a little bit by design. What we do in grand jury, it's confidential. It's there's a secrecy element to grand jury, and that's by design. Our room here, you can see some pictures. It was renovated in February of 2020. We got some really great technology in there to help us present cases. We have a really large television, and then the jurors actually have screens in front of them so they can see pictures, they can see video, they can see anything that we're trying to show them. And so this room, like I said, was renovated in February of 2020, and it's a drastic improvement from what we had in there before. You can go to the next slide. And you can, there we go. So what grand jury does is they hear all the felony cases in Summit County. In Summit County, we have about 4,400 cases a year, and those are felonies from any police agency within the county. Every felony charged in this county funnels through the grand jury. And what the grand jurors do is they listen to testimony and they decide if there is what's called probable cause for a case to move forward. Has everybody here heard the phrase proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Any nods? Okay, I see some nods. That is the standard of proof where we have a trial. If someone's going to trial, in order for them to be convicted of a crime, the state must prove the case, all the elements of every charge with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In grand jury, we are kind of at the other end of the spectrum of burdens of proof, where it's a much lower burden of proof. The burden of proof is just, could a reasonable person find that this crime occurred? And every person charged with a felony in Summit County in Ohio is entitled to have their case heard by the grand jury. The grand jurors serve as the first outside review of a case. So, you know, the police might investigate a crime, they might sign a charge and arrest somebody, and then that case, the first outside review is the grand jury. Every case goes before them. You can go ahead. All right, so this is a breakdown. I believe this is 2020. These are 2020 or 2021 numbers. We received, this is just kind of what the average year looks like as far as cases, numbers, and the outcomes. So we received 4,406 cases. These are felony cases from the various police agencies within the county. 3,894 times those cases went to the grand jury. The grand jury said, yes, some crime has occurred here. This case can move forward. 174 times we reviewed the case, and as an office, we decided to try to resolve the case in municipal court. All the cases that come to our office, I review them, and some of them, for various reasons, we may think, let's try to resolve this case in municipal court before going to grand jury. And that would be for a misdemeanor. The municipal courts cannot resolve felony cases. They can't take pleas on felony cases, but they can resolve misdemeanors. An example of this would be, let's say someone gets arrested and they had, for having maybe one pill, they have an illegal pill, let's just say an oxycodone pill, and they have one, and they have no criminal history, they've never been in trouble before. Technically, having one oxycodone pill in Ohio is a felony 5. So it's the lowest level felony. We may look at that case and say, you know, this person's never been in trouble before. They had one pill, you know, they were, you know, cooperative. We may say, hey, municipal court, can you resolve this case and see if we can maybe cut this person a break? And we are allowed to exercise that discretion in those kinds of cases. 147 times a case went to the grand jury and the grand juror said, no, there is not enough evidence for any crime to move forward at this point. We'll talk about later what happens when the grand jurors issue a no bill. 158 times cases went to the grand jury, and the grand jury said, yes, a crime has occurred, but it was not a felony. It was a misdemeanor, and they can send the case back to municipal court for prosecution on a misdemeanor. For example, if someone is charged with, let's say they stole something, and the police originally think that the value of what was stolen is over $1,000, that's going to be a felony, a low-level felony. But let's say after the evidence comes out and the grand jurors review it, they say, no, yes, something was stolen, but it actually is only worth $800, under $1,000. Well, that then kicks it down to a misdemeanor. And so they would be saying, yes, a crime occurred, but no, it's not a felony. It is a misdemeanor. And that is what a remand is. So 158 times a case was presented to the grand jury, and they remanded it back to the municipal courts. I'm going to kind of clump together not enough information and return to agency. So 16 times we received a case and said, listen, police, we get that you did an investigation here, but we just don't have enough information. You need to do more work. And we send it back to them. Sometimes they do more work and send it back to us again, and then sometimes they do not. But that happened 16 times. 2 times the federal government came in and wanted to prosecute a case. If you are breaking a crime at the state level, you are likely breaking one at the federal level, but you don't get prosecuted for both at the same time. And sometimes people get charged in state court, and then the federal government says, we'd like to prosecute this case, and then they take the case from us and we dismiss our case here. 2, I would say, is a low number. That typically happens more often than that. So I'm surprised by the 2 for that year. 14 pre-indictment dismissals means for whatever reason, a case was dismissed prior to us taking it to grand jury. So a person was charged by the police, something happened, and we dismissed the case. It could be a number of things. One of the common reasons, unfortunately, is if a defendant passes away. We're obviously going to dismiss that case, but that is a typical reason why we would dismiss the case prior to taking it to the grand jurors. James, you can go to the next slide. So the grand jury consists of 14 people, and that is actually in the Ohio Revised Code. We can have up to 14 people. Those people are going to be Summit County residents. 12 jurors will be reporting jurors, and then we have 2 alternates. Sometimes our alternates have to come in a whole bunch, and sometimes we don't bother the alternates at all during a term. 9 jurors vote on a case, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. They have 2-month terms. So we pick 6 grand juries a year, and they serve for 2 months. Is anybody surprised to hear that they serve for 2 months at a time? I see some yeses. Most people who get called for grand jury service, when we do jury selection and we tell them that they might be there for 2 months or 60 days, they have the same reaction of, what do you mean 60 days? I have a job, I have a life. But believe it or not, we do find people who can do this service and their employers will pay them to do this service. And so we get 14 people every 2 months to serve on our grand jury. They're subject to service 5 days a week, but we usually only meet 4 days a week. Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, the jurors are with me and they hear any kind of case possible. And then on Fridays, they are with Prosecutor Greg Peacock, who's a supervisor in our office, and he does intimate partner domestic violence cases, and those are on Fridays. You can go to the next slide. So how does it work? On the average day in grand jury, I told you I'm in there Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. The grand jurors could hear anywhere from 30 to 40 cases. And I know that sounds like a lot, but some of them don't take very long to do. But each case, a witness will come in and testify. Most of the time, that's going to be a police officer or a detective or some kind of law enforcement officer. So essentially, I let the grand jurors know, we're going to hear John Smith's case, and a witness comes in, they're sworn in, everything is recorded, and I will ask that witness questions to essentially establish what the police are alleging happened. Unlike a trial where one case is going to trial for, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In grand jury, our jurors are allowed to ask questions and the witnesses can answer them. So a regular jury can't do that, but in grand jury, it's an investigatory body and they are allowed and encouraged to ask questions of the witnesses. So after I ask questions and the jurors ask any questions that they want, our witness is excused. I want to add something here about asking questions. Sometimes I can instruct a witness not to answer a question. And it's only in cases where if a juror is asking a question and the answer is likely to give information that would not come out at trial, meaning down the road if somebody wanted to take their case to trial, we do instruct the witness not to answer. And that's for a couple of reasons. While the rules of evidence don't apply in grand jury, we still don't want evidence getting in if it won't get in at trial. So we don't want the grand jurors indicting cases based on information that a trial jury is never going to hear. It doesn't seem like that would be smart for us to do that, because if we get cases indicted based on one set of information, then try them on a different set of information, I don't think that would go successfully. So the other time that we'll tell, the most common time is if a juror wants to know what somebody's criminal history is. We do not tell the grand jurors what someone's criminal history is because it's unlikely to come in at trial. There are some limited circumstances where somebody having a prior conviction for something is an element of the offense, and we do have to tell them in those cases, but most of the time we don't tell somebody about a defendant's prior criminal history. After all the questions are asked, we let the witness leave the room, and then the jurors and I discuss the law and the charging options. So typically, they'll have a vote sheet in front of them with a list of charges. We can change that, we can add to that, we can do a lot of different things. But we like to give the grand jurors options. We tell them, here's your facts, and these are the maybe 4 or 5 crimes that possibly apply. And those jurors are allowed to ask me questions. I can define any terms for them. I can answer any legal questions for them. And I explain the elements of each of the crimes that are possibly going to be voted on. Once they're done asking me questions, I leave the room. And only the remaining jurors, and there's 9 jurors that vote on each case, only those 9 jurors stay in the room. Any recording that we have, we use a recorder, but other counties use an actual court reporter. That recorder goes off and the 9 jurors deliberate in confidence in the room by themselves. We actually have a little light that tells us when they're done deliberating and we can come back in the room. But one of the crucial parts of grand jury is that those 9 jurors have a time to deliberate, and that their vote, while we file it, their deliberations are completely confidential. James, you can go on to the next one. So like I said, when we're done with the witness, we'll talk about the charging options. This is, I may give a recommendation. I don't like the word recommendation because I will never tell the grand jurors what to do. They do not serve as a rubber stamp for what they think I want them to do. They are there to make the decision. I can point out things I think are wrong with the case or things that I think are strong with the case, and I can ask them to really talk about certain things that I think maybe a case is lacking. If a charge has 3 elements, I may say, hey guys, I know you heard evidence about element 1 and element 2, but really talk about if you heard any evidence to support element 3, because I really want them to be sure on what they're voting on. So I don't give recommendations, but I definitely give them a little bit of guidance as far as what they need to talk about. Then I'll leave the room and they discuss the case. If there are 5 charges on the vote sheet, they have to discuss each of them and vote individually on each charge that they're presented with. James, you can go to the next slide. So only 9 jurors vote. And I think I told you before, we have 14, 12 of them are reporting, but only 9 vote. So there are more people than needed that hear each case. And that again is by design. If you're listening to the testimony and you think, oh, you know what? I know these people, I know someone involved, I heard about this, I live near there, the juror then can step out. Only 9 people who have no conflict with any of the case, any of the people involved in the case, stay and vote on a case. So if we have 12 people there, 3 people will step out on each case. It can be any 3 people. The same people don't have to step out every time, but only 9 people remain in the room. Our grand juries do elect a 4-person. That person's in charge of counting the votes and recording the votes. They also sign all the paperwork that we file with the clerk's office at the end of the day. We encourage the jurors to have some discussion on each case. Now, as the time goes on, there's less discussion because they know more about the law and they've seen enough cases. But in the beginning, we do encourage them to have as much discussion as they need, and we budget time for them to do that. Their deliberations are completely confidential. They're not recorded, and they actually take an oath when they're sworn in that they won't discuss what they hear in grand jury outside of grand jury. You can go on, James. So I told you before, most cases there's going to be a law enforcement officer as a witness, but sometimes we're also going to bring in witnesses or victims. And James, you can click through. I think there's probably like 7, 8 things on this. I think there's one more. Yep. So we don't bring in a victim on every single case for a couple of reasons. It's completely discretionary by me or whatever prosecutor is presenting a case, whether or not to bring in the victim. We're going to bring in victims to testify if there's no confession, there's no witnesses, or there's no corroborating evidence for the crime. If victim testimony is essentially the evidence in the case, we're going to want the victim to come in so the grand jurors can hear him or her and evaluate their credibility. Victims are not going to come in and testify if we have a confession from the defendant or we have lots of corroborating evidence, like if something's on video or we have DNA, we don't bring in the victim. Children, really rare. I've had some teenagers come in and testify, but we typically do not bring in child victims into grand jury. Sexual assault victims, somewhat rare, but again, if the only evidence is victim testimony, we will have the victim come in. And I told you this is partially by design. It's not our job down there to make victims come in and have to retell the story to a bunch of strangers a bunch of different times. We try to limit the number of times we make victims talk about these horrible things that happen to them in front of a group of strangers. Victims do come in a few times a day. And again, it's discretionary by the prosecutor who's presenting the case. James, you can go on. In grand jury, the defendant does not testify. In fact, the defendant, who is the person who is charged with the crime, usually does not even know when their case is going to the grand jury for a couple of reasons. For example, in a case that has a victim who may be testifying, we do not want the defendant to know when that victim may be coming in to testify in grand jury. Defendants typically have an idea when their case is going to the grand jury, but they do not know exactly when it's going, and they are not entitled to be there. But in certain circumstances, we can ask the defendant to come testify. It's pretty rare. I'd say it happens 1 or 2 times a term, so maybe a dozen times a year. This might happen if the defendant has no criminal history. It comes down to the victim's word versus the defendant's word, and there's no corroborating evidence. The most common time this is coming in is if we think that the defendant may raise an affirmative defense, like self-defense. If the defendant is charged with a crime and he's raising the affirmative defense of self-defense, and we think that that may be a credible defense, we may ask the defendant to come in so the grand jurors can hear that. Again, if it's likely to come out at trial, we want the grand jurors to know about it when they're deciding what charges should be indicted and what charges should not be indicted. The way it works is we can contact the defense attorney and we can ask them if they would like to have their client testify. The defense attorney will talk to his or her client and they'll make that decision together. If a defendant decides not to testify in grand jury, that is not something we tell the grand jurors. We don't tell them anything about it. It's not, again, not something that would come out at trial, so it's not something that we tell the grand jurors. If a defendant chooses to come in and testify, Their rights are read to them, and their attorney is not in the room with them, but right outside, and they can take breaks and talk to their attorney at any time that they want to. Defense attorneys can contact us on any case. It doesn't happen very often, but they can reach out to us in any case and say that they'd like their client to testify. James, you can go on to the next one. There are a couple different kinds of indictments. We have direct indictments, bind over indictments, and secret indictments. And you can go on to the direct ones. Or, I'm sorry, secrets first. So secret indictment sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. It just means that the person has not been charged in any other court or charged by any police or made any arrests prior to coming to grand jury. This is really common with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, and several kind of Department of Health agencies within the state. So, for example, the BMV. There are investigators that work for the BMV who investigate fraud within that organization. So people who commit title fraud, fake IDs, anything that the BMV would do. They have agents who investigate those kinds of fraud. Now, they don't have police cruisers and handcuffs, and they don't go out and arrest people. But when they have an investigation and they want to charge someone, they send that case directly to us. We review it, and if we review it and it's sufficient, we'll take it to the grand jury. So there's no arrest before the case goes to grand jury, and that's a secret indictment. The case essentially starts with the indictment in grand jury. All right, you can go ahead, James. All right, so this is our county. You can click through a couple times. I think some stuff will pop up on the sides. There we go. We have 3 municipal courts in Summit County. All the charges that are not secret indictments are going to start in one of these municipal courts: the Akron Municipal Court, the Barberton Municipal Court, and the Stowe Municipal Court. You can see those are all the various villages, townships, cities within our county that we can get cases from. And the vast majority of our cases come from the Akron Police Department and the Akron Municipal Court jurisdictions. And while the Stowe Municipal Court has the most jurisdictions, we probably get the fewest cases out of there. But we do get a good amount of cases from all 3 municipal courts every week. You can go ahead. So the direct indictment program is something that Summit County has had for quite a while. Essentially, these jurisdictions participate in the direct indictment program, and they can send their cases directly to us, and we'll get them to the grand jury very quickly. You can see most of the jurisdictions in Summit County are direct indictment jurisdictions. So when an arrest happens or they're investigating a case, the case comes directly to us, and we can present the case to the grand jury. We move things a little bit more quickly with these jurisdictions. If you go to the next slide, we have bind over jurisdictions. Those are not jurisdictions that participate in the direct indictment program. So what that means is that there are some things that happen in the municipal courts with these jurisdictions before the case comes to us. And the biggest part about that is it just takes longer for cases to get to us. So if someone is arrested in one of these jurisdictions, they're going to have a couple of appearances in municipal court before they come to common pleas, and it might take a little longer for us to get that case in front of the grand jury. Additionally, we have a little less discretion with those cases. I told you before, we can send some cases back and exercise some discretion. We have less discretion with these jurisdictions because they are bind over jurisdictions. You can go ahead. The jurisdictions that are in red are going to be those bind over jurisdictions, and everything that's in blue is a direct indictment jurisdiction. The big difference again is just that we can get those cases a lot faster, and we can get them in front of the grand jury much more quickly. Right, you can go on. All right, so like I said, the big difference, the direct indictment process. So if I get arrested tonight, I'm in Farallon, so I'm going to be arrested by the Farallon Police Department, and they might sign a charge on me tonight. If I go to jail, I'm going to appear in the Akron Municipal Court tomorrow morning. I'm going to see a judge. I'm going to get a bond. They're going to ask me if I can afford an attorney. If I can't, they're going to appoint one to me. And that's all going to happen right away. But at the same time, the Fair Lawn Police Department, because they are a direct indictment jurisdiction, are going to be sending us, being the Summit County Prosecutor's Office, the case at the same time as I'm appearing in municipal court. If you go to the bind over page, James, the next one, the big difference is if I get arrested, let's say in Twinsburg Township, not Twinsburg, but Twinsburg Township. Yes, it's different. If I get arrested there, I'm going to appear in municipal court a bunch of times. I'm going to have what's called a preliminary hearing. And it may be a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks before my case gets what we call bound over from municipal court to the Court of Common Pleas. Basically, things happen in municipal court before it comes to us in the county, at the county level. And it's usually not a terribly long time, but it's definitely slower than a direct indictment jurisdiction. But once the case is bound over to us, we begin the process just as we would with a direct indictment jurisdiction case. Go on. All right, so possible outcomes at grand jury. If the grand jurors hear testimony and they see some charges that they vote on, and they decide no crime has been committed here, there is not enough information for this case to proceed, it's called a no bill. And there's no formal charges then filed against the defendant. The defendant is discharged immediately. If that person is in custody, they are released. And if they're not in custody, they are notified of their no bill. If the case is remanded, the case gets transferred back to municipal court. We talked about this in the beginning. And if the jurors vote yes, a crime has been committed, and yes, it is a felony, there's enough evidence for the case to move forward, it's called an indictment. I think that we talked about in the beginning probable cause. So we're not in grand jury talking about guilty or not guilty. It's just, is there enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial and formally charge somebody with a felony? So an indictment just means that the grand jury said, yes, there is enough information here for this case to move forward. There's enough information to find probable cause that a crime was committed and the case moves forward. Go ahead, James. So after grand jury, if a case is indicted, it will get assigned to a judge. In the general division, we have 10 judges. It gets randomly assigned to one of those 10 judges. If somebody is already on supervision or has a pending case, so if I'm on probation or I have a pending case in the Court of Common Pleas and I get a new one, my case is going to go where my cases that exist already are. I'm not going to have 3 different judges. I'm going to be with one judge. But all the cases get randomly assigned to a judge within the building. There are pre-trial. Tanya, are they going to have anybody talk to them about kind of pre-trials, negotiations, things like that?
You could go into that a little bit because it'll get touched on in other areas, but you can kind of set the tone for it.
So a case gets assigned to a judge. They have what's called an arraignment, where the person with his or her attorney appear before the assigned judge. The judge formally tells them what they are charged with. They can answer any questions at that point. They can readdress the issue of bond if that's in play. And then after arraignment, there are pretrial hearings. Some of those people appear for, some of them don't, but it's basically the court's way of checking in on the case, seeing where are we at with this case. The process of discovery is where the prosecutor's office and the defense attorney, we share information. So any reports, videos, lab results, anything that we have as the prosecutor's office, we have to give that over to the defense attorney. Anything the defense attorney wants us to know about, that's their opportunity to give it to us. That process is called discovery. And then there are negotiations. You guys obviously know that people charged with felonies, certain types of felonies, they can go to prison. Most people get probation or what we call community control. Tanya, is anyone going to talk about diversion or IILC?
Yeah, they should be able to do that. We'll get that covered, but you can just touch on it just to have them hear it for the first time.
So some folks are going to be eligible for diversion, which means they can do some programming, do some perhaps treatment, programming, any kind of service, and their case gets dismissed. That's typically for nonviolent first-time offenders. And then there's the intervention in lieu of conviction program, which folks who perhaps find themselves in trouble because of substance abuse or mental health issues, they can petition for what's called intervention in lieu of conviction. They can then receive intervention in whatever form they need it, and that is in lieu of conviction. So if you complete, let's say it's a substance abuse issue, you complete some substance abuse treatment, your case can be dismissed. So you're left without a conviction. So there are several ways, if you have a felony pending in Summit County, that you could really end up with no conviction on your record, and hopefully you get some treatment that you need. Obviously, people can take their case to trial. I'm sure Tanya could probably tell you numbers on how many cases go to trial, but the vast majority
I
of
will be
cases,
talking about that, yeah.
the vast majority of cases do resolve via negotiated plea. And whenever there's a plea offer from the state, it's discussed with the victim, the investigating officers, and they obviously have to be kept in the loop on what we're doing with those kinds of cases. Is there any more slides? I'm not sure. Oh, no, there's not. All right, does anybody have any questions about grand jury? I saw something in the chat.
I saw Michael Thompson said, why would a jurisdiction not do a direct indictment?
So, I can't answer for those jurisdictions, but the direct indictment program, they typically have somebody within their agency or somebody within our agency that submits all their paperwork and compiles all their cases for us. So if they don't have somebody that they want to employ to do that or pay to do that, they may not want to. It could be a financial decision. But other than that, I don't know, because I think the direct indictment program really makes it a lot easier on these jurisdictions to get their cases to us quickly and efficiently. But typically it would be a financial decision. And it's not the police agencies that make that decision. It's the township or city or village through which they, for which they represent.
Joan asked, is there a penalty for someone who breaches confidentiality?
Never happened, but yes, you're sworn in by the judge, you take an oath. And so, yes.
Well, I get that, but I know, and maybe I watch too much TV, but there's always, part of the television show where somebody's talking to somebody else, and it's like, what happens? Because it's bound to happen. What happens to the person? And I mean, and what do you have to do to prove that that person's even doing that? Kind of thing. It's just, it seems like there's an awful lot of trust put on these people that, I've gotten, where I've gotten those notices to come in. I've never wound up in a jury, but it's like, how do you make sure that those people are actually going to follow through and be forthright in doing, I'm not asking this right. You know what I'm asking though, right? I mean, basically, what happens if they don't follow the protocol?
You mean if they talk about what happens in grand jury when they're not supposed to, or if they just break the rules?
Sure.
Oh, sure, both. It's never happened that somebody has, we found out that somebody's talking about what they're not supposed to talk about. But any issues that we have, there is a presiding judge in the general division who presides over grand jury. We would bring that to the judge's attention. I know the judge can certainly excuse a juror who's perhaps being disruptive or not following the rules or violating the oath in some way. Judges have a lot of power to, maybe perhaps find someone in contempt if they're not, if they're violating their oath. I've never seen it happen, but it would be up to the judge to decide what would happen.
Okay.
Valerie asked, oh wait, Sharon, it looks like you had a question. If you want to unmute.
I'm sorry, I was going to go ahead and type it in, but I was wondering, you mentioned, Marissa, that about what happened. I was going to ask, what happens when the victim and the detectives disagree with the agreement or the, I think you said a plea. What happens when there is like this disconnect, like, no, I want this to happen over here?
I had the same question.
I don't want to steal anybody else's topic, but if that's going to be talked about, but that's a really difficult part of this job. You want to fight for justice. We seek justice in our office. And sometimes if there's a mitigating factor or there's a problem perhaps with the case, that's a difficult conversation to have with an investigating officer or a victim and say, hey, I know you want, the max on this, but here are the reasons why perhaps the max is not appropriate in this case. That's a difficult conversation. But the important part is that they have a seat at the table when that discussion is happening. I would say that most of the time, the goal is to find a negotiated plea or an outcome that everybody's happy with. But you can't make everybody happy all the time. That's always the goal. And sometimes those are really tough conversations to have to explain why perhaps the outcome that people were hoping for is not going to be the outcome that happens.
All right, thank you.
So along those lines, somebody had asked, Valerie had asked, do you usually agree with the decision of the grand jury?
Most of the time.
Personal question, right?
Personal question. The groups tend to take on a little bit of an identity.
By
there's
group, you mean each grand jury.
Grand jury, because think about it. They serve for 60 days. Each group's going to hear about 800 cases. And they're going to, sometimes as a group, they find like maybe one type of crime or one type of offense that they just either they feel really strongly about or they really don't like. And it's always very interesting to watch them kind of develop a personality as a group. You kind of learn what they like and what they don't like. Sometimes they will come out of left field and surprise me with something, and I don't have to agree with it. That's the role of the grand jury. They're not just a rubber stamp for me. They can do what they want. So I've certainly been blindsided by some results, and some I agree with and some I do not. But that's their job.
Alexander asked, can you quickly recap the secret indictment process, please? Investigation by an agency like the BMV sent directly to the prosecutor's office. If enough evidence, grand jury process begins, ?
Well, before anything goes to the grand jury, we review it. So if they send us an investigation and we have to have a good faith basis to take a case to the grand jury. If I say, I don't really know that anything happened here, I don't know that there's a crime here, let's just see what the grand jury thinks. I can't do that. I have to have at least a good faith basis in what I'm presenting to the grand jury. So it's reviewed by us first. And assuming we find that there's a good faith basis to take a case to the grand jury, we will present that case to the grand jury. The investigator from the BMV might come in, testify about what he or she found in their investigation, and the grand jury decides then whether or not to issue an indictment. So unlike our other cases where folks have already been arrested by the police, meaning they've already been charged in municipal court, folks with a secret indictment are not. They may know that they're being investigated. They may know that this is happening. It's not secret in that regard. It's just that the indictment would be the first time this person is being charged.
And that's important to know because I know with a lot of advocates have asked me, well, why did it say in the newspaper that someone was charged with this? And then the grand jury decided to indict lesser or higher. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that the police are the first people who see that case. It's not us and our grand jury. And so they may or may not have enough evidence, and the grand jury may or may not decide to agree with them. So things aren't rubber stamped all the way through. So if you see something lesser or higher than what was reported earlier, it's because the grand jury just decided otherwise, right?
Well, there's also it's a really good point. It said in the beginning of the PowerPoint, it said that the grand jury is the first outside review. Let me give you two scenarios. Let's go back to my example that I get arrested tonight by the Fairlawn Police Department and I go to jail. I'm going to see a judge in the morning. Grand jury for my case, probably going to be in about a week. It happens very quickly. Now I'm going to change my facts a little bit. Let's say tonight after I get off Zoom, I decide to go to my local Walgreens and it's closed. So I take a brick and I smash the window and I go inside and I steal a bunch of stuff. Well, they're going to come in the morning and they're going to see, oh God, somebody broke into the Walgreens. They're going to pick up that brick maybe and send it off for DNA. maybe in 3 months they get results back and they find out that it was my DNA on that brick, and then they charge me with breaking and entering. Well, I'm in the wind, I'm gone. They may issue a warrant for me and I'm not picked up for maybe, 9 months, maybe, let's just say 9 months. So now we're going almost a year and I finally get maybe arrested on my warrant. Then at that point in time, my case will go to the grand jury. So do you see the difference on an investigation where there was a warrant issued versus an arrest that happens tonight? There could be this long period of time, and sometimes things change. So if I get arrested and then the investigation keeps going, grand jury could be within 7 days and the information doesn't really change. Versus if my charges get issued tonight, I don't get arrested for 9 months, lots could happen between now and 9 months. But the charges may change. More information may be learned in that period of time that might change what the original charges were. And a lot of times, particularly like in the media, it's put out there what they're charged with, and that could very well change at grand jury after all the information comes out.
And you see that there's different charging agencies, like you'll see the one police department, and then maybe a different, people charge differently. And then you go to a grand jury and they might decide differently. So there's lots of checks and balances in the process, just right in the beginning. Trish, I see you have a question.
I wanted to ask, I have kind of a two-part question. Maybe you talked about it or maybe you did not. I've been listening the whole time though. So how are the grand jurors selected? Like, is there a criteria that you guys look at, or educational background, or a neighborhood that they look at?
Uh-oh, muted.
You muted.
We love you.
Sorry.
Or how are they kind of selected is kind of my part one of the question. And then also with them serving for 60 days, is there a such thing as like juror fatigue? Do they get kind of, like day 6 or day 58? Do you notice that, they're just kind of anxious to be done with the whole process or anything?
Your question, we bring in, I think we subpoena or we summons, I think it's 100 jurors. And then we pick from there. I'm not looking for anything in particular in grand jury selection. At a trial, I would say most attorneys would probably agree that they're looking for jurors who are going to agree with them. Whereas grand jury, I'm looking for all kinds of people. I want people that are going to agree with me. I want people that are going to challenge me, because that's likely what a trial jury is going to be like. We want lots of different people. I try to get people from all over the county. I don't want too many people from the same city or same township. Try to get lots of different people. I try to be diverse in gender, age, race. I want a good mix of people on the jury to keep it representative of the whole county. And then as far as jury fatigue, no, I don't think they get jury fatigue. It's actually the opposite. I'll tell you, when people get selected to serve, they're kind of like, oh, crap. Like they want to figure out a way to get out of it. I will tell you, and Tanya can probably agree with this because Tanya comes at the end of grand jury and helps me pass out some certificates and thank the jurors. Many of them say that it is the most meaningful experience of their life. They hear and see so much that impacts them, good or bad, but it is something that very few people get to see, very few people get to experience. Jurors cry in there. They yell at each other in there. It's emotional stuff. It's heavy stuff. It's meaningful stuff. And they're serving their community. And I will say, without question, every term, somebody asks if they can stay and serve another term. And they say that it is probably one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives.
Hey, I want to jump in really quick. Also, Marissa, I just want to make sure that I have this correct as well. And I want to make sure that Trish has her question answered. Our office doesn't send out notices for jury duty, whether it's a grand jury. It is a Summit County court, the jury commissioners that send it out. The names are chosen, I believe, from if you have a driver's license. So you obviously, I'm sorry?
Voter registration. It's registered voters.
So it's registered voters. So it's 18. So the age is a minimum of 18. There's no maximum age. And it's throughout the entire county. So I just want to make sure that.
Sorry, I thought you meant like, how do I pick
both.
amongst?
I think both. I think
I meant all of the above. Yeah, I wanted to know everything. So,
because the notices are sent out by the jury commissioner, but then it is up to you to choose. I mean, when you get the people actually to come into the grand jury, how were they chosen of the however many that were the notices that were sent out?
We ask questions. So the ones, let's say the jury commissioner summons is 100 people, and he's correct. The actual summonsing of jurors is not done by either side, defense or prosecution. It's by the jury commissioner's office, and that's for both grand jury and petit jurors. They send those things out to anyone who's a registered voter in Summit County who's above the age of 18. So if you meet those criteria, you could be summoned for any jury in Summit County. Once they report, we do what's called jury selection. We'll ask, first of all, whose employer is going to pay for you to be here? We don't want anyone to have a financial hardship. We want to know if anybody has a medical hardship where they think it would be hard for them to be here every day. And then we ask general questions, just seeing if folks can remain fair, impartial, listen to the facts, listen to the law. We don't want people who have strong opinions one way or the other. We want people who can be neutral, listen to the law, apply the facts.
Okay. The next question is, can a grand jury juror talk about a case once it's been adjudicated?
Their oath said that they promise to keep secret all deliberations. So anything that happens in a deliberation, no, I don't think so, unless the judge allows it.
And then Kim had asked, is the jury, the grand jury sequestered?
No.
Oh,
You want Jessica has her hand up. Yep.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question, kind of two questions. I'll start with the new Akron task force that's supposed to be formed. Now, what part of the process would that be before the grand jury? Would that be after everything is adjudicated and they listen to a lot, or we just don't know yet because it hasn't really been formed yet? But what part of the process would?
Not sure which task force you're talking about.
So the mayor of Akron.
It hasn't been formed, and I think that's a task force more geared. The mayor and the city council each have proposed a different task force,
Right.
different obligations, responsibilities, and who has which power to control those. And no decisions have been made, and that would be more between the city and the police. So that'd be before it ever.
Before. Okay. And then my next part was, I saw a domestic violence felony on there for rape, but for other domestic violence, how does that fare with going through this process? Do they even come into this process because they're not felonies, or are they mostly, I guess, misdemeanors?
Domestic violence?
Yeah.
Domestic violence can be, the first time domestic violence happens, it can be a misdemeanor. If the victim is pregnant, even on the first time, it's going to be a felony. But most domestic violence charges are because someone has a prior conviction. So your first domestic violence is a misdemeanor. If you get any subsequent after you've been convicted, those will be charged as felonies. So there are some in municipal court as misdemeanors, some in felony court as felonies. If you have multiple priors, it enhances even more. But we have certain crimes that are enhanceable. So first time's a misdemeanor, subsequent times it's a felony. Domestic violence is one of those types of crimes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
And also I'll throw in there too, when it comes to domestic violence, first of all, domestic violence cases are probably one of the more difficult cases that our office has to prosecute.
For sure.
It also depends on whether a weapon was involved. There's a lot of, qualifications as to why sometimes a case comes to our office and the case may not. I did want to mention, because Joan brought it up, and I appreciate Joan bringing it up, because, if you're fans of any type of crime show on TV, you watch either Law and Order or Criminal Minds, or my daughter loves all of them, and she's watched them a million times. Try your best to forget everything that you've watched on TV, especially when it comes to those types of programs. They're great entertainment. They are not necessarily exactly what happens in an office. And hopefully, throughout the 10 weeks that we're here, we will be able to at least open those up and kind of let you know kind of a little behind the scenes of what we do. my role as director of communications, I work a lot with the media. As prosecutors in a prosecutor's office, we are, unlike any other attorney in the state of Ohio and actually in the country, there are certain rules and regulations that we as a prosecutor's office need to follow that defense attorneys don't. So we are not allowed ethically to, and we won't usually anyway, because we don't want to try cases in the media. But a lot of times you will see, if it's a high level media case, information that hits the newspaper or television or social media that just is not true, or things change as the case makes its way through our office because we do more investigation. We look a little bit closer at situations and try to figure out what's going on. So there's a lot of things that may happen that you're reading about or watching and wondering why things happen. A lot of times, unfortunately, our office can't release that information until the case is done. It's a little frustrating too on my side. I think it's frustrating on a lot of people who work in our office, but those are certain regulations that our office has to abide by. So I know that there's some frustration on all ends when there are cases out there and people are wondering, well, why were charges, lowered or increased, or, it's a whole process that we have to go through. So I appreciate you mentioning that that you've watched crime shows on TV, and I think they're great. But as Marissa had mentioned, we don't solve crimes in a half an hour. It can take months to do certain things, and potentially sometimes years.
And we did mention domestic violence. So we will be, one of the topics we will be covering is more domestic violence, in more depth. This is just, today we're just talking about how does a case basically get into our court system, and we'll delve in more to the details of each case. There is another question from Donnell. Do people with mental illness or drug addiction get places in treatment right away? So I'm guessing this question is right before the grand jury or at grand jury time when there's a case and there's a clear drug issue. Does this person get treatment? And if so, who decides that?
Do we have any Oriana House people on our class this year? Anybody?
We do have one person from Oriana House.
Okay.
I'm here.
He's here.
Going back to my example of if I get arrested tonight, I'm going to go to the county jail. If I have a substance abuse issue, mental health issue, it's likely not going to be addressed night one in the Summit County Jail. But in Summit County, we are very fortunate to have an absolute just plethora of places and programs where folks can go. So perhaps pre-trial, while my case is pending, before I've pled or been convicted at trial, my options of where I'm going to go are maybe limited, but we do have some pre-trial places, the Cask facility, a couple other places where folks can go while their case is pending, and they can receive treatment in those places. But in most cases, treatment and services like that are going to be after the plea as part of the negotiated plea. But we have a lot of places in Summit County where folks can go and get help. Meredith, did you say that you were with which facility? CBCF, is that what you said?
Yeah, CBCF female facility.
Okay, so CBCF, the
And
community-based facility.
yes, and right now we're getting a lot of the pre-trials, and the thing is that a lot of the ladies who are coming for pre-trial, they don't have their ORASs, so we can't immediately start them in treatment. And then if we do start them in treatment, then they go to the court, and then they get released maybe like 2 days later. So, and then, it's a long process. I got a waiting list right now in my building. I think 15, 20 people supposed to be coming from the county. Don't know if they're going to come, but I have no beds for them right now in the female building. So that's the kind of unfortunate thing.
Just to kind of translate what she just said, her facility is community-based corrections facility for women. Obviously, bed space is an issue. there aren't unlimited spots for people at some of these places. But the important part is, maybe instead of being in the jail, you can go to one of these other facilities and receive treatment and services while they're being held. And so your answer to your question is maybe. Sometimes folks can get some treatment and some intervention while the case is still pending, but most of the time it's going to happen afterwards.
There was a program that started literally right before COVID, and I think kind of deflated during COVID. I don't know if they brought it back up, but it was shortly after the grand jury, like at the bond hearings. That's the next step, right? They were connecting every defendant with a social worker who can kind of walk with them through the process. What do they need? Do they need job placement? Do they need drug treatment? Do they need whatever they need? It's kind of like an all-around social worker at the bond stage. So really at the beginning, just right after grand jury. But I haven't heard anything about it since COVID. I know Catholic Charities was involved in it. They were the ones providing the social workers. But the idea, your question is a great question, because I think the idea is being worked on and has been thought, like how early can we get resources? How quickly? And I think, we should keep asking that question throughout our classes and thinking about that because I think that the earlier the better, right? Joyce, did you have a question? I see your hand up.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Will you be going over initially the different departments within the prosecutor and what those departments, like the gentleman next to you, Mr. Polak, he was saying he's a photographer, and Ms. Marissa is over grand jury. And as far as the prosecutors are concerned, when a case goes to trial, how are the prosecutors determined? Because it took me a while to try to understand why I never saw Ms. Walsh doing the cases. So I'm really interested in the different, I guess, departments within the prosecutor and how they all come together when it comes to a trial or whatever. Thank you.
That's a great question, Joyce. And yes, we will be going through all the departments. And you'll see, and you will be seeing Ms. Walsh here during our classes. But you'll also see that we have 200 plus employees and lots of departments and programs, which takes a lot of leadership, which takes away some time from the courtroom. So you probably haven't seen her because she's helping to, work with our leaders in our office, to make those decisions on who does what, when, where, why, on a regular basis. With such a large staff and lots of programs, she's definitely out there. She's just not always in the courtroom, but she has been there. It's just a matter of how many places she can be all at one time. You will hear from a lot of our divisions, most of our divisions, not all of our divisions, but I will be going through them as we keep talking. I try to bring in a lot of our programs, but unfortunately we only have 10 weeks, and I want you guys to have a lot of the knowledge, bestowed upon you that I know people are interested in, like, officer involved cases, body cameras, grand jury, domestic violence. If there's more that you want to learn, please, or things in specific, please send me an email, because I'd be happy to incorporate them, because I want to make this class important, what is important to you. I want to make sure that we're giving you that information. And I will side note, you are correct. James is an excellent photographer, but he is also our communications director. So there is a communications division of our office, and he basically is at every meeting. I always made jokes with him like that. He's everywhere. So he will always be enlightening us with just great facts, and connecting it to us in a way that only he knows as our director, because he's just everywhere. Does that answer your question?
Please understand real quickly that it was not a slight against Ms. Walsh.
It was an excellent question.
How you all are picked for who's going to do what cases.
Can I kind of piggyback off of what you
go for it. Yeah.
I'm going to give you an example. So just the general division, in the criminal division. Criminal is one of the divisions within the prosecutor's office. That's where I am. It's the attorneys that deal with adult felony defendants. So in the general division of the Court of Common Pleas, there are 10 judges. And I told you, a case that gets true billed, an indictment, can get assigned to any one of those 10 judges. Within our criminal division, there are 2 attorneys, 2 prosecutors assigned to each one of those 10 judges. So there's 20 prosecutors amongst the 10 judges. Then there are 5 supervising attorneys that supervise 2 of those courtrooms. So if, going back to my case, I get arrested tonight and my case gets through grand jury, I've been indicted, and I get assigned to, let's say I get assigned to Judge Oldfield. Tanya, who's in Judge Oldfield's court right now? Help me out. You know?
It'll be Felicia. Isn't Felicia?
So it's Felicia is the supervisor. And I believe Joe Vance and Tristan Siri are the 2 prosecuting attorneys.
Right.
So if I want to take my case to trial when that time comes, it's going to be assigned to one of those 2 attorneys, or possibly the supervisor if my case is very serious, that is assigned to that judge. So that's kind of how in our office, how a case finds its way onto someone's desk. It's by judge assignment and which prosecutors are assigned to which court. As you can imagine, it would be very difficult if I had, 100 cases in 10 different courts and I had to be in each one of them all the time. It's much easier if I'm responsible for 100 cases in one court with the same judge. And we all rotate around. So no one's in front of the same judge for very long. I think it's about every year, everyone rotates around. So that's how a case assigned gets to one particular prosecutor. It's usually by judge assignment.
Thank you, Marissa. There's one other question here, and I really appreciate these questions. Oh no, I think that was it. James, did you catch any other questions?
No, I think we got through them all. I know that we allotted usually until about 7:30 or so, and obviously it's 7:53 now. So I appreciate everyone staying late. If you do need to go over the next 10 weeks, if we go over our time, it is okay for you to go. Obviously, we all have lives and we all need to take care of whatever we need to take care of. We'd love for you to stay. But as Tanya had mentioned, if you have any questions that you don't get answered in the Zoom meeting and during our presentation, please email us. We would be happy to respond to anything that you ask, as long as we know the answers to, or actually can respond to. But I think we got through them all, Tanya, so far.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. Does anybody have any, verbal questions? We're going to hope to end at 7:30, like I told you, to honor your time and then make the rest of the time for questions, so that if you want to stay on and ask, that you could be part of that conversation. Marissa, we really appreciate your time and being here and explaining the important process of grand jury. And everyone, it was great first class. We're looking forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
What's
you.
the topic for next Wednesday? What's next week's topic?
I will be sending that to you on email. Hopefully you'll actually get every week's topic at that point.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Angela Smith, if you're still on, it was good to see you.
It's good to
Thank
be
you.
seen. Thank you, Selena.